So this is class 19 of this gargantuan size less series called Revelation, End of the World, or Cause for Hope. And each lesson being an hour or so long, or a little more sometimes, that means 19 or 20 hours of me talking about this, which is a lot. And not all of it was good, I will allow. Not all of it was good. Some was good. But today we're going to cover Revelation 1800s to present, and really stick in these the decades up to this modern moment. Although we'll be talking about a lot of beliefs that were forged more than a century ago. But first, a brief review. You can tell I was clearing my throat when I typed this first line of this paragraph. I wrote, "Well, this is it, the end." For months now, we've studied John's apocalypse. My hope has been that I may contextualize Revelation so that we may understand what this letter meant to the churches in Asia Minor to whom it was addressed. What we discovered along the way was that those symbols and scenes from Revelation that seemed cryptic and indecipherable to modern readers were at one time readily understood and accessible to those first century readers who were familiar with apocalyptic literature. It turns out that Revelation was written to a specific people in a specific time and place. So the symbols therein and meanings behind them were accessible to them. Revelation was not written to confuse or mystify its intended audience. Indeed, if this were so, apocalypse would be a misnomer, for the word literally means to unveil what is hidden or covered. So I'll add as an aside, our modern misunderstandings or inability to access Revelation or find it frustrating stems from this very fact that our ability to access it has been lost through centuries. But that was not the case. John did not write this way to be cryptic. He wrote this way to help his audience understand their world. John uncovered his truth so that first century Christians living throughout the Roman Empire may, one, better understand the spiritual cultural landscape they inhabit. Two, understand that Jesus, the Lamb who was slain, has already shown himself to possess a power greater than Rome's. And three, those who bear witness to the gospel in the face of persecution will share in the victory of the conquering Lamb. And four, in the meantime, don't give up. Hold fast to hope, for God will not let evil run away with everything. However, while Revelation at one time carried meaning to first century Christians in Asia Minor, the question remains, in what ways may it inform our lives now? The harlot astride the beast may have represented Roman debauchery, decadence, and violence, but that was a long time ago. The number 666 may well have pointed readers to Nero, but he is long dead, as is his empire. Does Revelation have anything to teach modern Christians? I very much think so, as I'll explain before we conclude this lesson. I hope. Where we're going tonight, we'll consider and critique the unique interpretive framework, emphasis on unique interpretive framework of John Nelson Darby, who lived between the years 1800 and 1882. We'll consider it in the light of Scripture, the church tradition, as well as some of its theological implications. Second, we'll notice how Darbyism has more or less become our culture's dominant interpretive framework, so much so that most modern readers are unaware of how new and unique its perspective is. And then third, the three terms or concepts we'll be covering in depth are the millennium, the rapture, and the Antichrist, each arriving from this system of John Nelson Darby. And there is this picture, and I read this last week. I won't read it again, except just to touch on the bullet points. Born in 1800. You may remember I had that moment with a typo where it said he was born in 1500. Not the case. In 1800, he became an Anglican priest, and he sustained an injury, and while convalescent, he began to study the Bible. It became disillusioned with the established church, saying that it was in ruins, and then began to study the scripture with a small eclectic group called the Plymouth Brethren, still a group today, by the way. And it was one of those Protestant groups that formed during the Protestant Reformation that held the scripture as the ultimate authority and also had a unique take on it. So Darby came up with this system that we call dispensationalism. He did so in good faith. I don't believe he was a crook or a guy who was trying to mislead anybody. My take on him is he was an authentic and genuine man who really felt that he was arriving at the normal or plain meaning. But as James Eford writes in this longer quote that I'm not reading here. Of course, Darby and his followers determined which of the approaches was appropriate in any given passage and decided what normal or plain meaning was. Don't they all? Don't we all always think that we have the plain and obvious meaning? Well, more on him, and these are again more quotes from that same book. And to give his own work in interpretive framework, John Nelson Darby's interpretive framework context, I want to go even further back to talk about how the return of Christ or the Parousia was held in the earliest days of Christianity, and then on a little bit past that. That will be relevant in moments. You'll soon see why. Quoting James Eford from his book, Left Behind, ? What the Bible really says about the end times. He writes, since the ascension of Jesus, perhaps even before, members of the Christian church have been curious about Jesus's return, the conclusion of history, and the final victory of God's work begun in Christ. Of greatest concern is when these events will occur. The early church of Peter and Paul believed that the parousia, that is the New Testament term for Jesus's return, would occur within their lifetime. In fact, some of Paul's advice given in response to his church's questions was based on the sincere belief that they were living in the last age and generation of history. A sense of urgency is evident in the preaching of the early church. After AD 70, however, with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the realization that the church was entering into a second, and in some cases even a third generation, it became clear that Jesus was not going to return within the originally expected time period. This was an embarrassment to these people and caused many to rethink the issue. In fact, almost all of the New Testament books written after AD 70 in some way deal with the disappointment and embarrassment over the delay in the parousia. One can read Ephesians, which talks about the ages to come and future generations. The author does not seem to mention the parousia, however. In Matthew's Gospel, chapters 24 through 25, address a delay and conclude with a series of 4 parables that deal with how those left to work in the absence of a superior should react and behave when the superior's return is delayed. Matthew's point to the church is fairly obvious. Jesus has been delayed in returning. In spite of that, Matthew instructs us to continue doing what we were commanded to do in the interim period, no matter how long it lasts. Of course, the gospel concludes with the Great Commission and Jesus' promise to be with them until, quoting that passage we just talked about on Sunday, until the end of the age. There is no indication of how long that may be. Chronologically, the letter known as 2 Peter is the last of the canonical New Testament writings. The author explains that there has been a delay, but God will bring the world to an end when God decides to do so. No timetable is set. The church could have simply given up on the entire concept of the parousia, or the return of Christ, but instead reaffirmed its certainty that God's work begun in Jesus would someday be brought to completion. The temptation, however, is to attempt to set a date for the end times. Let me read that sentence again. The temptation, however, to attempt to set a date for the end times did not go away. In the late 2nd century and beyond, many speculated about this issue. The return of Jesus was linked to the concept of the 1,000-year reign of Jesus with the saints in Revelation 20. I'm almost done. There was no absolute consensus, but the basic idea was that the millennial kingdom had already begun. It was the church in the world now. After 1,000 years, Jesus would return and conclude God's work. This school of thought is called postmillennialism, i.e., Jesus returns after the 1,000-year reign. One can imagine the anxiety felt by people living in the 990s, rather. The 990s. One might say there was a Y1K problem. You may recall the Y2K problem of maybe a quarter century ago now, or lack of problem, rather. But the year 1000 came and went, as did the year 1100 and 1200. At that point, most believed the number 1000 to be symbolic and felt that after that period of time, God would send Jesus back. As one recalls from the study of the history of the church, many changes were taking place in the Reformation and many alternatives to the church's polity and theology that arose after the Reformation. Also, social and economic upheavals in the 1700s and 1800s due to the... I talked about how in the early Christians believed that Jesus' return was imminent and right around the corner. And then as generations continued to live, they needed to find a lot of the gospel writings and the letters are meant to help explain to the early church how they should live. And now that, it seems that Christ's return is delayed. And a lot of the Christian writings are having to do with that. I was saying that there was no consensus as to what the millennial kingdom was precisely, but many believed it had already begun, and that after 1,000 years, or the year 1000 AD, that Christ would come again, and that would be the end of the millennium. But then when that happened, they began to interpret the millennium more metaphorically, because they couldn't quite make sense of why 1,000 years would where it would fit in any schema. And this continued on to be basically the way that people saw it until the Protestant Reformation, where, as we mentioned last week, ideas really went wild. The cat was out of the bag, and as many movements, there seemed to be interpretations as to what the end times, what the book of Revelation may have meant, and where one's adversaries, theological adversaries, might fit. And so now topics like the Antichrist became popular. Or last week we read how Martin Luther, the reformer, had no real interest or affection for Revelation, because he said he thought it was neither apostolic nor prophetic, until he saw the advantage in seeing the Pope as the Antichrist. Then he began to employ it again. But my point is, it wasn't as it would become in our time now. So it was in that overall context of a couple thousand years of a few ideas, but no real hard lines as to what Revelation, how it spoke to the church in any given era. It was in that context that John Nelson Darby tried to nail down the details, the world events, and the timeline, so of what would occur in the build-up to the Parousia. So he turned to a variety of biblical texts written during a specific time and context long before him, and he appropriated them to his own time, more or less disregarding what they meant to the original audiences. Poetic words meant to describe Israel's fall to Babylon, or apocalyptic visions from the book of Daniel meant to describe its recovery from Babylonian exile, were taken by Darby to be about events to take place in his own era. He also linked historic events not previously thought of in conjunction with Revelation with images described therein. We have no time to delve into the details here, but here is the overall outline according to Darby and his modern adherents. And I found here the least complicated chart I could find, because these things tend to just be just covered in lines, and you have to almost get a microscope out or a looking glass to read them accurately. But this gets the gist. Humanity divided up, or the human history divided up into dispensations or more different moments, with these titles: innocence, creation of man; time of conscience, where we developed a conscience from eating the fruit; government, this is all the Old Testament, Moses, Ark, King David. Well, actually, that couldn't be. What? Point is, different periods represent different manifestations of God's interaction and grace, is the idea. And he laid it all out here. And you may see a few things I want you to note. Christ returns twice, right? Returns at the end of a tribulation before Christ's millennial kingdom, but then also before the tribulation to collect all of the saints in the air. That's called the rapture. Also, he believes in a quite literal millennium, as in 1,000 years specifically. Remember last lesson, or the last lesson we talked about, Revelation chapter 20. We discussed the millennium and how it was the 1,000 years was symbolic of the completion of God's work, and it gave the saints who had suffered and been persecuted an opportunity, a moment to appreciate the rewards of their faithfulness along with Christ, which is common in apocalyptic literature, to give the most faithful a special place of reward. And that's what's going on there. But Darby took that 1,000 years and said, no, this is going to be a time and a period in history, and tried to predict when that would happen. And then also he posited a literal singular Antichrist. So first, this millennial reign of Christ. The millennial reign of Christ had long been understood by many to be a metaphor for the era of the church, as in Augustine's City of God, as we talked about last week, or maybe the 1,000 years symbolically represents the completeness of God's conquest over Satan, even in the present age. In this view, when the servants of Christ are dedicated and devoted entirely to Christ and to God's kingdom, Satan is bound. But when these people become apostate and ally themselves with Satan or his representatives, then Satan is loosed, free to do damage to God's people. Revelation 20 then calls Christians to a choice between Christ or the dragon/Satan in every age, with an awareness that our failure to choose the reign of Christ over the competing powers in our world is why the forces of evil are free to wreak havoc in our world. That's one interpretation of the millennium, just as a metaphor for generally the ways in which the world may conform to the realm of God. Eford writes, again, the interpreter must remember that this is apocalyptic literature and that certain characteristics and ideas may appear strange to readers today, such as this idea of the millennium. Whether these ideas are strange to us is irrelevant, since it is the duty of the biblical interpreter to attempt to understand the meaning of the text as was originally written and understood. In almost every apocalyptic work, one section presents a special reward for those who have kept faith in the midst of persecution to the point of laying down their lives for the cause. This special reward is depicted in symbolic language, as one would expect in apocalyptic writings. Oh, and the picture didn't turn up for this. Oh, well. In any case, the number 1000 should be taken symbolically, as nearly all mention of numbers throughout Revelation are meant to be taken. We've talked about the symbolic relevance of numbers like 3, 7, 40, 12, 1000, 144,000, etc. So with this in mind, the saints reigning with Christ for 1,000 years then means that Christ's loyal followers, especially those who have perished in the persecution, are with him completely. Perhaps the intended meaning may be always, because another way to interpret that last line about them being with Christ for eternally can also mean always. No reference, though, to a literal 1,000-year period to occur on earth is meant to be implied. But this is not how Darby interpreted the millennial reign of Christ. He interpreted it to be a period in real-world history and time, and that all the confusion and chaos of his age was described in Revelation as those events that would presage the return of Christ. His task going forward would then be to untangle and decipher those events and explain where they fit on the prophetic timeline. Some even say God has a time watch. Now, if that all sounds familiar, it should. That's because today, basically, that's the way most of the people, if not everyone, who was part of my Christian community growing up understood Revelation as something that was describing events in and around us. And our job was to find out just when the hammer would drop and the tribulation would come, was what we thought. But that, first off, is not the way that it has been read historically up until John Nelson Darby. But John Nelson Darby also believed that he was on the cusp of the imminent return of Christ and thought that all the symbols in there had to do with the political entities of his own day and the goings on of his own day. And it was thought that one thing I think is kind of funny about this perspective is, God has this plan that's moving along, and then sometimes humans can drop the ball or fail, and then God will readjust. And some people believe that God will stop the divine stopwatch and until somebody kicks it off again and we get back on track, as if you could, get off schedule, as it were. I just think that's a very odd way of seeing it, but some do see it that way. But also with the millennia in this dispensationalist Darbyist perspective, a lot is talked about the Antichrist. In apocalyptic literature, it was almost always assumed that there would be a transition between an old age and into a new and more perfect age. And we see that here in Revelation, Book of Daniel, the two most obvious examples in our Christian and Jewish scriptures. But this time of transition was believed to be messy, violent, and loud. And these feelings and images were conveyed in apocalyptic literature using many of the apocalyptic images that we've read about. Moon turned to blood, earthquakes, plagues, and pestilences. Sometimes an author of these terrible events is included, meaning not an author of the book of Revelation, but somebody who is orchestrating these terrible events as part of the apocalyptic narrative, as was done in Daniel chapter 9, where we read of a period of persecution to follow the rebuilding of the temple. Daniel chapter 9, verses 20 through 27, is where you can read about the rebuilding of the temple. And after that is commissioned a high priest, or the anointed one. And for a period of time, that people would find reprieve. But then the Holy One, scholars believe the priest to be Onias III, he was killed. This is what we're reading about in Daniel chapter 9. But then came one, an evil ruler, who would desecrate the temple. Most scholars believe that the one who sets up desolate monstrosities in the temple is a reference to Antiochus IV. All of this was to take place in a 70-week span, said the apocalyptic writer in Daniel, symbolic for God's complete work, as we've been saying. Just as John's apocalypse pertained to a Roman context, Daniel's apocalypse pertained to the rise and fall, again, of various empires that occupied and possessed Israel, Babylon, Persia, and the Greeks. Why I bring that up is Daniel orchestrated in that, or had mentioned in that, this one who would set up desolation in the temple, who scholars believe to be a reference to Antiochus IV, who did historically set up idols in the temple. And that's thought that everything that happens in Daniel, you can find historic corollaries for that are quite clear in the symbolism there. But what John Nelson Darby did is he took this figure mentioned here in Daniel, and then he took the ominous figures mentioned in Revelation, and then the Antichrist mentioned in First John, and another one mentioned in Second John, and kind of combined them all together to form the Antichrist as this penultimate evil that we are looking out for. He took all of these texts listed here below to do it. Daniel chapter 8, verses 9 through 14, 9, 24 through 27. They're listed here. I'll not read them all now. And he interpreted these each as having to do with the same individual, when they do not. There is no predicted singular Antichrist type figure, as is commonly believed today in the Bible. And the Christian scriptures and traditions, Antichrist is anything or anyone that is antithetical to the ways and mission of Jesus Christ. That is all. So there's a lot that's Antichrist in the world, and Antichrists, plural, in the world in that sense. And that's the way that the word has been employed in Christian writing for millennia, up until really the Protestant Reformation, and really until John Nelson Darby's way of approach to seeing it. And along with that also came, and this is usually the doozy, the rapture. An idea arose out of Darby's attempt to synthesize all that he thought of as future-telling Bible prophecy. And I'm speaking here of the idea by now so popular that you may not know that the word does not even appear in the Bible, the rapture. Darbyists, I'm quoting James Aford again, the Darbyists argued that among themselves about the timing of this major event, but all affirms its literal reality. Some of these theologians believe the rapture will occur before the Great Tribulation, some during it, and others afterward. My father, by the way, believed afterwards that we would go through the Great Tribulation. That's just as an aside, personal note. These are known respectively as pre-tribulation, a mid-tribulation, and post-tribulation. All are, of course, premillennialist, meaning they all believe Jesus will come before this millennial reign, as Darby described. Remember, again, Bible scholars believe symbolic of the completion of God's work and another opportunity for the saints to be exalted as living faithfully. But no, he believes it's a literal 1,000-year, but that Jesus would return before that. And there would be this period of tribulation. He takes a passage from the book of Daniel that we were just reading, in fact, Daniel chapter 9, also other parts of Daniel and other parts of the New Testament, and posits that there will be a period of tribulation, a 7-year period, which again, by now you should see 7, symbolic for, again, completeness. Basically, that means in Daniel, when the tribulation has run its course. But Darby takes it to mean a literal 7 years. And so he thought that coming up in his lifetime would be 7 years of persecution, but before that, the Christians would be whisked away. And that is because of what he reads in Revelation chapter 20, where he sees that obviously something happens that brings about the realm of God. So Christ must have come back. Now, in the text, it doesn't say that Jesus came back there. It says that an angelic being is the intermediary that brings about the millennial reign in Revelation. But Darby believed that there would be a literal period of immense suffering for 7 periods, and then a literal 1,000-year period of Christ's reign. And it wouldn't just be a spiritual reign, it would be a political rule. And so the premise that Jesus would return in 1,000 years, that's what he believed. Now, there's a few problems with this, and I'm just going to read I'm just going to read them that I listed here. And this is way too simplistic. This is where I was frustrated throughout the course of today and yesterday putting this together. And I was even working on this up until a half hour before our time here together, because I'm still not sure that I was able to narrow enough. But here's, in my view, the problem with this belief. One, as we just discussed, the literal 1,000-year period of Christ and the church's political rule is not what is described in Revelation chapter 20. So the premise that Jesus will return to presage that 1,000-year reign is a wrong run from the jump, if you're just going off of Revelation. There are a few other passages that he will point to make the case for this. But if you're just going off Revelation, it's not what's talked about. John's metaphorical use in Revelation of the words two. Second problem with this view. John's metaphorical use of the words Israel and Jerusalem and modern Darbyist use of them carry two different meanings. Darby understood John to be referring to a political entity when referencing Israel, and a literal city of Jerusalem when referring to it. However, a more careful reading shows that John uses Israel, as do other New Testament authors, to broadly describe those who are faithful witnesses in opposing the powers of evil, and Jerusalem to metaphorically describe an imagined future where God and humanity are restored in unity. In other words, Israel now describes Jews and Gentiles as God's people who have responded positively to God's actions in the world and God's purposes in the world. This future, believed John the Revelator, would include Jews and Gentiles. No blanket condemnation of a race is implied. In fact, this would seem odd if it were, because John and the majority of his original audience were likely Jewish. But third, the reason why this belief is problematic is that nowhere is such an event in the Bible foretold. Now, there is a passage in 1 Thessalonians that we'll talk about in a moment. But once we have talked about that, it really is the only one that seems to describe an event like what you're looking at here. And the passage goes basically as follows. 1 Thessalonians 4. Let's look it up in my Bible here, because I have heard this, and when I read this too, you've heard it read at funerals, you've heard it read at other times, and a funeral is a very good fitting setting for it. I don't know why I'm flipping through screens here, but it goes 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 18. Brothers and sisters, we want you to know about people who have died, so that you won't mourn like others who don't have any hope. Since we believe that Jesus died and rose, so we also believe that God will bring with him those who have died in Jesus. What we are saying is a message from the Lord. We who are alive and still around at the Lord's coming definitely won't go ahead of those who have died. This is because the Lord himself will come down from heaven with the signal of a shout by the head angel and a blast on God's trumpet. First, those who are dead in Christ will rise. Then we who are living and still around will be taken up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. That way we will always be with the Lord. So encourage each other with these words. Now, what the Darbyist perspective does is it takes that and says, oh, there is a description of the rapture that we have forced into Revelation chapter 20 that comes before the millennium. But remember what we said at the beginning or near the beginning about the parousia, or the second coming of Jesus, and the church's early church's belief, or the first Christians' belief, that he would come in their lifetime. And in the first books, like Ephesians was cited, there is no talk of the parousia or the second coming as something in the future, and no apocalyptic writings like at the end of Matthew, because by the time those books had been written, there had been a second generation, and there was anxiety amongst those who were born that came up, and also about those who had died, especially because if Jesus was supposed to come back and the saints are going to be caught up in the air, what of those who have died? And so here, the writer of 1 Thessalonians wants to assure the church that those who had died before them will be with God. In fact, they're going to be collected first because, first in line, I guess. But the point is, it's not about a rapturing of humans in real time. These are pastoral words meant to help a church reckon with something they did not expect, which was that they would live to see some of their relatives die before Jesus came back.
Heath,
That's yes.
I do you have a particular screen you're supposed to be showing at this time? Because you're back to it's everywhere now.
Oh yeah, that's what I'm showing, and I was reading from my actual Bible.
Okay, all right, because I wasn't putting the two together. Sorry.
Oh right. So yeah, the next slide does. Yeah, we're more on the rapture here, and I was reading a popular passage that is often cited in evidence for the rapture, and I was giving it its context, but I had my Bible out to do that. I didn't have the text in here. So now, fast forwarding now, these beliefs that I am arguing very briefly and inadequately in this short time together, that I argue are not scriptural, are not, or if they are scriptural, they're not the common understanding, and they're forced readings, and they have not been believed for the first 1800 years of Christianity. But what happened was, throughout the mid to late 1800s, missionaries carried Darby's beliefs to the United States. And you may have heard of all the revivalist movements that were happening in New York, what we call the burnt over district, where we got Seventh-day Adventism, we got Mormonism, we got Jehovah's Witnesses out of those movements, Mary Baker Eddy's Christian Science. It was a lot going on. And in that context, we had missionaries coming across from Scotland and the UK generally to proselytize this perspective. And that's how we ended up with it everywhere. And then in 1909, the Scofield Bible was published, and in it are contained notes, commentary, and translations, all intended to guide a reader to a Darbyist perspective. On the pages is commentary advocating solely for the dispensationalist perspective, inserting concepts like the rapture where they never were. Then, again, going really quick here, in 1977 was published Hal Lindsey's The Late Great Planet Earth. I can still picture my father's copy and the dust jacket of it. And in that book, it was more than insinuated that Jesus would return in 1988. I would have been 3 years old at the time. In that book, Gog was Russia, Magog, China. The chapter on China's role in biblical prophecy is named The Yellow Peril. I kid you not. In 1988, well, it came and went. And we moved on to other perils, racist designations for entire people groups that we force into Bible prophecy, thinking that we have sanctioned to just use them as pawns in this geopolitical game. But recent editions of this book, Late Great Planet Earth, have been published since with amendments and addendums. I bet you can't guess what they cut out. Perhaps a prediction for a 1988 return. Either way, in the early 90s came the Left Behind series by Timothy LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins. Jerry B. Jenkins being a sports writer turned ghostwriter for Timothy LaHaye, who had a variety of religious programs and endeavors. And the book sold millions, and then came the movies. And so now casual observers of Christian culture would think that the Darby's perspective to be the default one. And in fact, growing up, I thought it was the only one. I thought it was the only one and a timeless one. Now, here we're going to also talk, and this is especially relevant today, where do the Jews fit into this schema? And here is where a theological belief can turn hurtful and even cause great harm. Early Christian and Jewish writers, like Peter, Paul, and John, did not see the Jewish race as a monolith. Like in the last text, Hal Lindsey saw the Chinese as a monolith and wrote a chapter called The Yellow Plague, or The Yellow Peril, rather, right? Thinking of an entire group speaking in one voice with one idea, very simplistic, not how humanity is. You still hear it today. Oh, the Chinese are over here doing this, and the Iranians just in this lump sum are doing this, and the blah blah blah, and that's a very dangerous mindset to have. We need a more nuanced view of every people group. And Peter, Paul, and John, being Jews themselves, did not believe that the Jesus movement would leave the Jews behind. In fact, they saw great continuity between what Jesus called them to and the callings placed on them by the Torah and in other Hebrew writings. They saw the Jesus movement as an invitation for all to join in a new work God was doing in the world, but this by no means negated what came before. This is where you get all of those passages, like the passage in Matthew where Jesus says that he did not come to cross out any of the law, but to fulfill the law. And for Jews, that was very relevant. Nor did this negate the piety and faithfulness of Jews who did not join the Jesus movement. Whenever there was a confrontation between Jewish leaders and Jesus, or the early Christians, The confrontation was not between Judaism and Christianity, but rather between the early church and those who persecuted it. Sometimes these were Jews, and when this occurred, Jesus and the apostles, all Jews themselves, reminded their opponents of the ways they were living in opposition to God's movements in the world as understood by way of their own sacred texts. Darbius, however, see the Jewish people as a monolith who have collectively rejected their Messiah. So modern Jews and the Israel state only matter so much in that they are pawns in God's cosmic game. Out of this was born a movement called Christian Zionism. In this view, Christian Zionism, Jews in the state of Israel are foils in God's plan. They are kept around, basically, so that they can set off all the events Darbius believe will occur near the final return of Jesus. In fact, some even believe they're helping the process along by encouraging the right geopolitical perspectives. Events from Revelation, such as the metaphorical restoration of Israel, which is standing for God's people all throughout the New Testament. But here they're like, nope, it's got to mean literally a nation state of Israel. Well, they insist on that instead of the Revelation reading, which is a metaphor for God's people, including us, the Gentiles, and the Jews. But also, they choose to see the holy city of Jerusalem, which in Revelation is symbolic for humanity living in harmony with God, Revelation 21. They see it absolutely literally as a city that they would like to see rebuilt just to be destroyed again. And so they look towards the violence in and near and around Israel as fulfillments of Bible prophecy, and so are therefore not to be avoided. Indeed, some look at what is happening even now as a fulfillment of God's grand design. And I ask you, what sort of design would that be? In any case, Christian Zionists champion the cause of the nation state of Israel, not because they think its objectives are just, but because they believe Israel is pulling the levers, setting off events that will bring about the ascendancy of a Christian theocracy. For this is how they envision the millennial reign of Christ. And I'll just note that in the end of last year, there was a big Christians for Jews rally, and a man named John Hagee, a pastor from Texas, was one of the main speakers, as somebody who was allegedly supportive of Jews and against anti-Semitism. However, you have to understand, from the vantage point of his Christian Zionism, he really is no friend to the Jews, in my opinion, as is illuminated by something he said in the mid-90s. And you can look this up for yourself. He said in a sermon that Hitler was a tool used by God to goad the Jews into the nation state of Israel. That the Holocaust was God's way of making this all happen and moving it all on, getting that cosmic stopwatch back on time, which I think is about as anti-Semitic as you can get, right? Who's really anti-Semitic? The Jews who wrote these books, who encouraged Gentiles to join them along with other Jews, or the Christian who in the 21st century insists on seeing all of these characters as pawns in a game with sometimes nuclear war as the end goal because they think God wants it so they can have a millennial reign of Christ, translate theocracy, with the likes of John Hagee calling the shots. And it's everywhere now. And again, I'll show you, before I get to this, I found this article from the New York Times, 1984 here. And there's the hard copy picture down there, but it's transcribed here. The title is, it's written by John Herbers, October 21st, 1984, a year before I was born. Religious leaders tell of worry on Armageddon view ascribed to Reagan. Quoting, first quote is, Ronald Reagan said it as governor and as president, in his home, in the White House, over lunch, over dinner, in the car, and over the phone, to religious leaders and lobbyists, to his staff, a senator, and even to People magazine. On at least 11 occasions, Ronald Reagan has suggested that the end of the world is coming, and it may be coming soon. And I'm not going to read this article for you, but it goes on to talk about Mr. Falwell. You may remember Jerry Falwell. And in this time, he was saying that Satan is rapidly approaching when the Soviet Union is on the rise, which, by the way, where is the Soviet Union now? European Union. Anyway, my point is, it's the same old playbook as today, only just back 30 years ago, using Revelation to name your enemies and to justify great violence against them. Do you think that Christians in the United States would be okay with the mass slaughter of Palestinians, including the children, if we did not see the Arabs as foils in an Armageddon plot. And I say we, I don't mean me. I mean some Christians generally, I believe, are okay with what's happening because they see the removal of the Palestinians as part of what God has ordained. And if God has ordained the bombing of children, then I'm not on board. So I wrote as the title, it's everywhere now. Here, how biblical prophecy shapes Trump's foreign policy for an influential group of American Christians. Support for Israel and hatred of Iran is based in biblical prophecy. That was published in 2020, before the events that we're now appalled by in Palestine. And I say all this to what's the relevance? What's the point? Why did I want to do this lesson? Well, I'll give my final thoughts. My purpose in engaging with Revelation with you springs from my own story with it. I was raised steeped in Darbyism, though I didn't know his name. There was and is still Schofield Bibles in my childhood home, though I didn't know what that meant. And in the meantime, the world was topsy-turvy around me. And some of my earliest memories of televised wars and the lens by which I was meant to understand these things was Bible prophecy. So when I read that article about Reagan from the year before I was born, it all felt so familiar, because I remember sitting on my grandparents' living room floor watching the Gulf War and being told how that was a sure sign that we were about to be persecuted as Christians based on their understanding. I was told by my father and Christian educators that Revelation described these wars in detail. I was told that these terrible events were as things should be, and that in the time God was using nation states as one would use pieces to a game. Nations like Iran, Iraq, Russia, China, or even Israel were not filled with people whose lives God desired to save. Rather, they were likened to beasts of Revelation, collectively bent on my destruction. And so they were mine and God's enemies. Does any of this sound familiar? And again, what can you do if they're God's enemies? You can justify a whole lot if that's the way you choose to see them. But the truth is, and as I've tried to demonstrate through these lessons, Revelation is not meant to tell us our immediate futures. We are arrogant to believe that this letter was written directly to specific communities, and that this letter written to specific communities, rather, way back when, must be only about us and in our own times. When put back into its original context and with a bit of scholarly research, modern readers can and should recover Revelation's true meaning as it was first received. This is what I've tried to offer, and what I hope you've discovered is that much of what Revelation called the first century Christians to is relevant today as it ever was. And here is why I love this book now, because of what it calls me to. And here's what I feel it calling me to. So here's in the sense, Revelation is prophetic to me in the sense that it calls me to these things. And to hope for a future brighter than I may have otherwise. It called early Christians to stand up and to not compromise their Christian witness, even in the face of intense persecution. It called them to identify the beasts of their day and the ways they were pawns in Satan's great war against God. And we too are called. Also, the message is for us that this too shall pass. God will keep the saints close and safe even through their deaths. In the meantime, stand against powers of evil in the name of the Lamb who was slain, for the Prince of Peace has shown us to be mightier than any weapon a human may forge. His sword or word conveys truth, and the word will win out in the end. The truth will win out in the end. In the meantime, I'll conclude with some words from John's Apocalypse that I think may translate even through the ages. This is from Revelation chapter 14, verses 12 through 13. And this is, I think, the point. Here is a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and hold fast to the faith of Jesus. And I heard a voice from heaven saying, "Write this, blessed are dead who from now on die in the Lord. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them." Whew. Okay. I realize that was a lot and somewhat scattershot. If you're stunned to silence, I will understand. Or if you have questions or comments, I would love to talk about it. Yeah, Laura?
This is, maybe a little bit of a rabbit hole, hopefully not, but just a comment that our pastor back in Ohio had preached, and I believe was talking about a girl having a vision, and that somehow
John Nelson Darby.
yes,
Yeah.
took that vision of that girl, and maybe even was a dream or something like that, and wove that into his understanding
Hmm.
of the rapture.
You
Yeah.
know, that does strike a chord. I wasn't able to. I had like what I was going to do today. Let me go get it. I have this little book that I've recommended before. And I recommend it. Not, I don't agree with everything in it, and there's some interpretations that I actually think from what I've read, I stand outside of. But the gist is basically fine, and it's called Left Behind, what the Bible really says about the end times by James Efford. And the reason I like it is because it is 100 pages long, and I stuck to this almost exclusively today. And yet, you see how long it was. I was trying to, I thought I was going to go through and just take a chapter, a brief sketch of Darbyism, which I can almost do in my sleep now. But then I was going to go through those three, the Rapture, Millennium, and the Antichrist. And as I got into it, I realized there's so much more that needs to be explained as to how these perspectives were developed. And then I realized this really should have been on its own course, like 6 weeks. And just today's should have been 6 weeks and split up. And so, but I was determined to get it done because we've been doing this for a long time now, and I'm ready to have a break from it.
I bet. Well, I like your view a lot more than those books, the Left Behind and all that rapture stuff that people are afraid
Ironically,
of.
I was allowed to watch them and read them, but they were nearly banned in the house because my dad was a post-tribulation rapture guy, and they all posit a pre-tribulation rapture. So as soon as everyone started disappearing off the planes and everything, you lost, and he started griping. I remember he just started going, oh. he started saying like, that's not the way it is. And
could you just re-summarize the timetable?
Oh yeah.
That what's his face? What's his name? John Nelson Darby said.
I gotta show you some of.
What was going to?
I'll show you a lot of these. There's different ones. There's different. I wrote Darby dispensationalism chart, and have you still seen my screen? Do you still see it?
Yes.
No, I mean I stopped sharing. Let me share my.
Not your screen. No.
Let me share my screen because I've got a I kept open the web browser where I found that chart because I found the absolute most simple chart I could find. It's the one off to your right, to my right. I don't know what side of your screen it's on. Right here's the one I used. But look at these things. I mean, this one's from the 1800s. Oh, it's all getting in the way. Well, you see this sort of thing. Sequence of the end time events.
Blurry.
Oh, really?
It's blurry, and then it comes in focus, and then it gets blurry again.
Well, that's because it's loading and coming in and clearer. So this website has dispensationalism 101, biblical theology, and here's a chart. I've seen this one before. This is a popular one, and so basically the dispensations are represented here by those little those kind of, if you were to cut the horizontal line in sections, like the lines going down, the dispensations would be the things that God dispensated, the grace God dispensated in unique ways in these different eras. And so in Darby's framework, he thinks, during King David, there was a very unique work. During Adam, there was a very unique work, and everything is very tidy. And you can, in that, find the timeline going back to the beginning of creation and then up to the present moment, and then postulate out to what comes next. The rapture, the millennial reign, the judgment, and then the perfect kingdom you see at the end. And you see all these scriptural references, written underneath. That's what I was talking about, just pulling in things from all of these different places that used to have a meaning in context for specific people. And he made it all about the 1800s. He brought it in and said, and look right here, the Jews scattered among the nations, right? Just all of them lumped into a whole, whole thing. It's just kind of pawns in the design. Kingdom of the Antichrist. Yeah. that was a more complex one. But the reason I picked the one that I did, we're gonna bring that back up here, was because it made clearer the idea of having these eras. Here they're very uniform. And look, every era is saved by works except for the Christian era where we are right now. Convenient. Anyway, that was a long answer to your question.
Yeah, but I can't see any of those charts because they're all blurry.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. I mean, it's okay. I'm just pointing. Can't see the chart.
Were they blurry? Were they blurry to everyone else?
Yeah, they're blurry. I thought it was interesting though. I did
All
see the dream, David's the dream of Nebuchadnezzar there was stretched out with a
It
could
became
understand
clear,
that.
but then it became clear at times, but then it would kind of fade again or something.
That has to do probably with the bandwidth of my phone, because that's where I'm still
Yeah.
streaming the internet. But I guess long and short of it is, I do believe that this book has the potential, the power to call us to great courage in these times, to call us to new ways of bearing witness in these times, and to identify the beasts of these times, the military arms that are wreaking havoc, and the greed, and all of these things you describe in colorful language. And the call to those 7 churches in Asia Minor is still the call today: persevere, witness, and if you die the first death, you won't die the second death. You won't die the second death. And that carries in every age. And it's important now because those who are using it the most are using it to do what I've been describing: tell which nation states and whole peoples are just, like pawns in a game. And I guess I read the title of that book from the chapter in Late Great Planet Earth on purpose: The Yellow Peril. You just got to think of the mindset of somebody who not only could think that they see that in biblical prophecy, but could title the chapter The Yellow Peril. In other words, more than 1 billion of God's children seen as a wave of something coming toward me, and it's straight up racist. That's what it is. And it lends itself to that because it makes you put, instead of seeing the metaphor in Gog and Magog, you choose to just find a specific. But you know what? I think that John the Revelator did that too, though. He kind of lumped all the Romans in one big pot, and he also lumped all the Babylonians as well. I guess it's just important to remember that no one, there is no one singular mouth for any group of people. And when you hear somebody talking about them that way, they're missing something. Well, thank you for your attention. I'm fighting the impulse to keep apologizing, but I did my best. And
We need to get that internet thing checked out, why it does that.
yes.
Yeah.
But
It's a good
If you
job for Gary.
3 hours ago,
your phone.
3 hours ago, I had a coherent. Imagine it as a if you imagine it as a manuscript, these slides as a long manuscript. I had a long runway, and I could see my way to the end, and I was nowhere near it. I had to cut and leave so much on the cutting floor, and that has more to do probably with the fact I get buried in the weeds and get too caught up in minutia. But I think actually more speaks to the complexity of this topic, and it should not have been tackled in one day.
It is very complex. There's too much to put together to be able to evaluate it so quickly. There's some things you got to think about. And this is a thinking thing, I think. So, yeah.
And we have the disadvantage of reading it, so long after it was written. If you were going to take a work of art from our own times that's easy for everyone to understand without very much explanation, like things that are commentary, I'm trying to think of A Christmas Carol. That's not too new, not too old. And if you're going to send that back in time, right? People may think you were talking about literal angels of Christmas past, present, and future. They may think that we are like they who knows what they would come away with, right? Because we understand the way that story functions as a fiction, but other eras you could conceive of where that before that kind of literature was developed, or places that didn't have it, and that's what we run into with Revelation. That's the greatest obstacle. Because I remember one time, Nancy, you had asked why did John make it so confusing, and the answer is John didn't make it confusing. It's the passage of time and what's lost culturally that becomes the impediment to us understanding them.
I see.
Anyhow,
I think
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think you did a fabulous job for the ones that I've seen and, either been present or looked at. I mean, it's just so difficult, like you said, to make it, but, you know, but it's so much better having even heard what I've heard, you talk about than the strange conglomeration if you try to put together what various Christians say about Revelation. It's just very disheartening if you go by that popular viewpoint, even talking to, like I said, Christians that, I'm
Usually,
so thankful.
usually Christians just set it aside because it's just like, I don't know what to do with it, except the ones that are really confidently shoehorning their own interpretive frameworks where they don't belong. And again, I don't think most of them are coming at it in good faith. They really are trying to
Right.
get at what God wants and help them live well in the time that they're living, understand. That was why my community does it still and did it. But what's lost is this powerful message that could have called this young boy to courage. Instead, it called me to terror and fear and dread. And it could have been like my dad could have said, I'll cut that. I don't want to name someone. People who raised me could have been like,
Right.
things may get really hard. In fact, I look out here and I see a lot that seems like Revelation to me. A lot of those whether nuclear fallout could be read as a plague. You can just name the things that we were afraid of and have been afraid of recently. And look to Revelation and how in that time when the Romans were the ones, and now it's other factors, the saint said, keep your chin up, persevere, be a witness. If they kill you, they don't kill you. It's okay. And in the end, there will be a kingdom and a realm and a city where we are reconciled. It's what Jerusalem was always meant to represent and can still, but again, as a metaphor, not as the thing that needs to be blown up to rebuild something else,
It says, Jesus said, I've gone to prepare a place for you. And that's where we're headed.
The only book in the Christian canon that is not overtly apocalyptic is that book, John, the Gospel of John. It's actually more philosophical in a Greek sense. I can't have time to talk about that now, but it's the only one that doesn't pull from the anyway. That's neither here nor there. Thank you for your kind words, all of you. And I've learned a lot, and now I have a framework for something in the future. So next year we'll do it again. Just kidding. We'll do well. Maybe in 5 years I'll look at it again and we'll have learned more and figure out how to do it. Take the bones of this and build on it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.